organizations navigate dynamic environments. He was previously the director of violence prevention for the Archdiocese of Chicago and served in the city of Chicago's Office of Violence Prevention. A former FBI special agent, Phil has led hostage negotiation teams and has expertise in violence prevention, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and crimes against children. He is an adjunct instructor at Northwestern and DePaul Universities and serves as an advisor to the National Security and Human Rights Law Center at Kent College of Law. Thank you, Phil, for joining us. We also have with us tonight Chris Patterson. He is the Assistant Secretary for the Illinois Department of Human Services Office of Firearm Violence and Prevention. Before creating the OFVP, he was the Chief Program Officer at Friends of the Children, Chicago, an organization that provides children facing the greatest obstacles with paid professional mentors. Prior to joining Friends of the Children, Chris was the Senior Director of Programs and Policy for the Institute for Nonviolence in Chicago. He has been a thought partner and an implementer for Chicago's largest violence prevention intervention efforts, Ready Chicago, and Community Partnering for Peace. Welcome, Chris. Thank you. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you for hosting this, the League of Women Voters, and in this partnership to create these kind of courageous conversations about issues that are really on all of our minds. You know, violence is really starting to shape our consciousness as a country, certainly as a city and a state, and how we are, and we've got to be more engaged and more conversational in how we're going to address it. So I thought maybe just, you know, you got a great resume, you know, a few other little tidbits about me. I'm also a survivor of gun violence. I was wounded in one of America's first school shootings. I was a 20-year-old college swimmer at the time, but there was a shooting in Winnetka, Illinois, where a deranged person attacked a grade school and shot 6 second graders. In the course of that person's escape, they crashed their car near my home and a hostage situation ensued. So, so really, even before I was doing hostage negotiation for the FBI, I was actually a hostage and negotiating for my folks' release. I was shot in that shooting and narrowly survived. I was shot in the chest, and the bullet came across and tore through my lungs and my esophagus, nearly hit my heart. And I've been working on violence-related issues and national security-related issues. And what I really want to start by saying that I am more hopeful than ever. And that it may be a surprise to folks when we see headlines about school shootings, and we average about 3 or 4 mass shootings a day. That meaning 4 or more people shot by the standard given to us by Homeland Security, and that we have more people shot in America than ever before. About 41,000 people last year were shot. But it's important to kind of understand the data. And I think that's where some of the insight and the hope and the opportunity comes from. That when you break down the 41,000 people that we lost, our fellow citizens that we lost, and it is no comparison to any other country. Next in line is Yemen, and they're dropping bombs, and there's a civil war going on. We are really unique, and it has a lot to do with a number of factors, but largely due to just an influx of guns, and that were spread without very good background checks, and really a culture that has been kind of laissez-faire about safety and firearms for decades. But let's break down those stats a little bit. The 41,000, about 2/3 are suicide. And that is the leading cause of gun violence in the country. And there are unique interventions that are different than some of the interventions we're going to talk, but also related. And that largely overlaps with coping skills and mental health and depression, but also access to firearms. What we know about folks that commit suicide or attempt suicide, that if they use a firearm in that attempt, that they are very often successful. And when they don't, that we have lots of opportunities for intervention. And just because somebody attempts suicide once doesn't mean they do it again, because often then we recognize that somebody's in distress and we surge services. And that's a theme you're going to hear a lot as we help you kind of understand reimagining public safety. That when we identify someone who is at risk, we identify someone who has needs, we identify somebody who's disconnected, that we surge resources in, that we don't let that continue. So the other part of that gun violence is sort of at the other end. And that's that mass violence that really drives our consciousness. It's the school shootings, it's the mass shootings, right? Like just happened in Highland Park, the one that I was involved in. And that's less than 2% of all gun violence in our country. So as frightening as it is, as tragic as it is, as deep as that gets into our psyche in terms of thinking about our safety in public places and in schools, and even in a place like this, that it's still very rare, but the interventions are quite clear. When you look at the data, the vast majority, and as many as 80% of the cases where a gun is used in school violence, in a mass shooting, that gun came from home. It came from the student's house, where there were parents, where there were adults that could have secured that gun. And you see the overlap there now with suicide, that a gun that is secured from somebody that is vulnerable, dangerous, or temporarily having difficulty coping, we can reduce school violence, school gun violence by 80% if we just locked up guns. So this is where some of the opportunities are. There's a large gun culture in our country. In the 1970s, a wonderful conservation organization that was very concerned about accuracy and marksmanship and pride. A wonderful organization called the National Rifle Association was taken over in the early 1970s by gun makers, explosive makers, and gun dealers and ammunition makers. And that's where there was a shift. There was a cultural shift in that organization that cared less about conservation, less about a culture of safety and pride and responsibility, and more about selling guns. And that's kind of the sad story of why we are in this position. But that culture of guns are also folks that care deeply about safety. And we need them to be part of the solution in recognizing that guns, even in your own home, secured, really reduce risk greatly. And then when somebody is demonstrating danger to themselves or others, that removing those guns using the new tools that we have here in Illinois and many states, firearm restraining orders, are incredibly effective. When we take guns from somebody who even temporarily has difficulty coping, and we surge in services and support, often we can get those folks back on track. So I'm very much looking forward to your questions and a good dialogue here. And I want to give Chris an opportunity to share some of the things that the state's doing, and maybe just contextualizing that because Illinois has two of the top 7 cities with the highest level of gun violence per capita, East St. Louis and Chicago. Actually, East St. Louis leads Chicago, even though we've got a lot of attention for Chicago. We have been investing in the last few years in data driven solutions that are about surging resources to communities to provide for the support of intervention. And this is Chris's life work, and we are very lucky in Illinois right now to have somebody who has a lot of lived experience and incredible level of expertise in intervention. And now he's leading that work in the Office of Violence Prevention for the state of Illinois.
Well, good.
Oh,
Thank
he's
you.
got
I
his
got
own
my
mic,
own.
too.
All right. Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. And good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Chris Patterson, Assistant Secretary for the Illinois Department of Human Service, Office of Firearm Violence Prevention. So if you're writing it, just use 2 lines. It takes me 2 breaths to get that out. I want to talk a little bit about, or a lot about, what the work that we're doing across the state, primarily around the everyday gun violence that we often see and hear about on the news. And so one of the things that I want to keep in context, though, and we talk about the very small number of individuals who actually drive violence across places like Chicago and East St. Louis, it's an incredibly small number, right? It's a number of about like 0.03% of the people or the population are actually drivers of violence. So when I think about it in that context, I think about it in a way that it's all the way curable is, right? It's something that we can actually address, and thinking outside of the box, right? Looking at some of the strategies we've employed across the state, across, the United States, how we've dealt with violence and crime. We've tried incarceration, right? And so many would admit, since the 1970s till now, that's not necessarily a strategy that has worked for communities, particularly communities that have been impacted by firearm violence. So what we want to do now is talk a little bit about what does that infrastructure look like, from my office. So you'll see and if you haven't known, so this all started with the Reimagined Public Safety Act. This act was passed last year. The Illinois General Assembly and the governor signed on. And then the governor dedicated $250 million towards this initiative. Historic commitment not made anywhere else in the United States. No other governor has dedicated that much money towards inner city areas, if you would, but then also cities outside of Chicago. What we want to do is definitely deepen our youth development programming, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like, but also apply and address root cause of why individuals are shooting each other or why people are shooting one another, right? And we want to go deeper than this idea that they're in conflict, right? So the question is, not so much what they were doing at 1 o'clock in the afternoon that led to the shooting, but why weren't they in school, at work? What mental health issues? What was going on at home? Like, we really want to start thinking deeply around that, because what's happening is individuals who are shot are often shot again or re-victimized, and individuals who go to prison simply don't learn their lesson there in prison, right? And so, like, again, a lot of the strategy we used in the past have not necessarily been working for us. So how I want to give you a look at what Chicago and Illinois looks like for us. Some of these communities that you see, there's 26 communities up here. They may be familiar communities to you. You may have seen them, you may have heard about them, you may have visited them. And what it is these are the communities that rank highest in rate and volume of shootings across the city of Chicago. So what we were able to do with our research group, folks from Northwestern and University of Chicago and others, were able to identify the communities, but then providers within these communities. And so each one of the communities, there's a convener role, and I'll talk a little bit about that and show you in our funding opportunities what that actually look like. And so what that means is, in order for my office to know what is happening on a day-to-day basis in each one of these communities, we have a convener. This convener or organization is responsible for being the eyes and the ears, if you would, from that community to my office. We want to know if someone is shot, was there a victim service representative that supported the family if the person died, supported the person if they survived? Are the street outreach workers, and I'll put definitions to some of this language, are the street outreach workers mediating that conflict, right? Because now we understand, and we have a tool called street outreach, as many of you may have heard about, that involves repurposing and involving people who have lived experience, who've been from those neighborhoods, giving them the support they need, and then putting them back into their neighborhood to become peer ambassadors, and to talk their friends, their colleagues, and use those relationships to talk people down away from violence. One of the communities in which I started doing this work is Austin, which you'll see in here. Austin, for the city of Chicago, has led the city in shootings and homicides for more than a decade. We're happy to announce, with the partnership with the Chicago Police Department, community members such as these outreach organizations that I'm talking about, youth development organizations, Austin is down 70% in shootings and homicides. That's phenomenal, right? It's the largest African-American community in Chicago. It's the largest community, period. There's about 100,000 people in the community of Austin, and they're down 70%. There's a lot of lives being saved because of because of this innovative approach to addressing firearm violence. Across the state of Illinois, you'll notice obviously a lot of the cities that we're familiar with. They're also the cities that are impacted firearm violence by rate and by volume. And so if you keep stats, or if you have been keeping stats on a daily gun violence trends, see that these are the communities and cities across the city who are at the top 16. So we've got some representation all the way on the north, all the way far west, all the way to Rock Island and down to Bellevue, Cahokia, East St. Louis area. Each one of these communities have a local advisory council set up, right? And so what we wanted to do was make sure that we didn't go into Peoria as an example and say, because this works in Chicago, we think you should work it down here, which is, it's indigenous, it's ingenuous, it's not listening to the community, the voice of the community is not heard. And so the local advisory councils gave recommendations to my office how we should fund them. And what we heard back, we got those recommendations back from the local advisory councils, and now we're in the process of funding each one of the cities. There's about $100 million of the $250 million that's going towards Greater Illinois, right? So again, a substantial investment towards a model that we know works for the communities that need it most. I want to give you a snapshot into what some of the dollars look like. Now, a lot of folks don't know that the Illinois Department of Human Service already does youth development funding and has been doing it for years. One of our more popular models is the Teen Reach model. There's a model called IYIC and some other, models that work in some of the communities I just showed you. From the investment from this year, we've been able to secure funding for fiscal years 22, 23, and 24. And we can also share this if you would like it. Over $152 million towards existing programming that we have going for young people across the state of Illinois, right? And so youth development is targeted towards young people who just need safe space, who need something to do after school or on the weekends or on the holidays or when school is out. We all grew up in that environment. We all had somewhere to go that was, safe and a space. So that's a model that works, and we want to continue to make sure that that model continues to exist. In the white, you'll see a little bit over $50 million. And of that 50 million, that is what's come from my office since February, since we've started our engagement across the city and the state of Illinois. So quite a substantial investment of the $250 million. We're hitting the ground rolling. I've been all over the state at each one of those local advisory councils, meeting with people, making sure providers had the support and technical assistance they need, the infrastructure, the framework to start a conversation around violence prevention that's actually going to work in their community. We've done some interesting things with the Chicago Public School. So one of the programs that we're backing with the city of Chicago and the Chicago Public Schools is the Back to Our Future program. What this does is it targets the highest risk young people who are involved in the school system who have been disengaged because of COVID for the last 18 months. So for the last 18 months, we've got in the city of Chicago, well over 20,000 students who are just simply not in school, right? So there's no truancy. There's, a lot of faults in the itself, right? But now you could either point your finger or you could say, okay, well, what do we do, right? Put that same finger in the dike to stop the flood. And so what we're doing is we're going out, we're engaging, or CPS is, excuse me, they're engaging the young people and their families, supplying the wraparound services that they need, giving them support, giving them a stipend, whatever we have to do to get them back in school. Why is this important? The young people that are being targeted for this program, maybe not the best word to use for what we're trying to do here, but the young people who are being, targeted, I guess is a good word, right? For this program are the young people who have been justice involved. Many of them have been locked up for carjackings. Many of them have gun cases. Many of them have been involved in gang activity. So this is our opportunity to pull them from that, incentivize them, give them the additional wraparound support and services that they need in order to be successful. Now, the question is, what is the difference between young people in Inglewood and young people who grew up in Winnetka? I would say kids all over, young people all over make terrible mistakes and they do weird things, right? But kids in prosperous communities and communities such as like this one have options. Would we agree that that's probably safe to say? They have something to do. They can get in trouble. There's plenty of trouble to get into, right? There's still robberies, there's still theft, there's a lot of drugs, obviously. But when you have other things to do, then you have a real choice. Some of the young people that we work with in the city of Chicago, there is no choice. The park districts are not open to them, or they're not safe. There's no school. There's, karate classes are not open. Piano is not there, right? And so what we want to do is we want to create an infrastructure that allows them to have those options. Those options then turn into choices. Choices then turn into longer extended lifetimes for the young people we're trying to save. So here's a snapshot into the notice of funding opportunities that we have. So notice of funding opportunity is the same language in the state as RFP for nonprofit or request for proposals. In the very beginning, you'll see that in December, we put out a couple funding opportunities, and we've been doing it consistently since December. But what we wanted to do was make sure that if we're funding violence prevention efforts, and it's such a magnitude of funding opportunity that we didn't want to set our providers up for failure. Every single provider that gets funded from my office has a technical assistance and trainer attached to their organization to help them through whatever their experience is. And so, there's varying degrees of expertise. And so some organizations may need a lot of help and some organizations may not need much help at all, but they got it if they need it. The next thing I talked about the community convener, which again was the eyes and the ears, right, from the city of Chicago. We're actually going to implement something like that for the local advisory councils outside of Chicago. We just thought it was such a good model to have that contingency there that would allow us to tap right into the community. If I hear about a shooting, I can call the convener, who's addressing it, making sure that the victim is not unattended to, because oftentimes people get shot, they're kind of released, they go back to their home, and to be frank, they're pissed, right, in a lot of cases, and sometimes those shootings lead to other shootings. And so we want to be able to keep in real time some of our developments that are happening in those areas. The notice of funding opportunities we have open now are violence prevention services, which is street outreach. And again, let me recap. Street outreach work is about getting folks who have been in most cases and not all, previously or formerly incarcerated individuals, people who have been former gang members, who have grown out of that lifestyle, who have, for whatever reason, decided that that's not for them any longer. They get the training, get the support, and they go back into their communities to uplift those younger men and women who are typically trapped in a cycle of violence. A case manager is there to do just that, create case management, identify the goals, help that individual reach there. And a unique component that we just created recently was the victim service model. Again, was to, walk towards this idea of hurt people. And if you can survive, and if you can give support and ongoing support to individuals who have been harmed by firearm violence, then we have a really good chance of decreasing, escalations. So a little snapshot into some of the dollars, and I would go just straight to the bullet point. We have $88 million towards our youth development statewide, $25 million towards our violence prevention work, and $100 million towards our state outside of Chicago, because there's almost like two places, right? So about 60% of violence that happens in Illinois happens in Chicago. So we almost approach it in two different frames. And so across Illinois, outside of Chicago, there's an additional $100 million towards this initiative. One of the things that we're really working on, and I was just speaking to Phil about this, was you'll see under the youth development, we have 159 LOIs, that's letters of interest. That means in the state process, you have to fill out a letter of interest to let us know you're going to fill out an application, right? We don't try to make it as cumbersome as it is, but one of the processes. But we've only in this example, we've only got 6 applications in at the time. Now this has changed a little bit since I have to update it, have my folks update it, but you'll see that we've got, between violence prevention and youth development, we've got well over 300 letters of interest. And this is second funding. So you'll remember that the first round of funding, we put out $50 million. And so we've got some good traction. People are, biting at the bit. We're in conversation with the right people. Now it's just a matter of getting them to apply for that funding so that we can get them off and squared away. So here's some of the links to my office, tell you a little bit more about our research group and our partnership with the Intergovernmental Committee from the city of Chicago and Cook County and ICEJA, another sister agency. And so with that, I can end this presentation. But what I was going to say was, in addition to, this great work that we're doing, this hits home for me as it hit home for Phil. And some of you it may hit home for some of you, right? This idea that violence and gun violence is never too far, and I would, stress to us that, if we don't have to wait till it's on our doorstep in order for it to be our problem, right? And I remember I grew up in foster homes and my mother was addicted to heroin. And I remember from a very young age seeing what heroin did to my family, my community. I grew up in the Cabrini Green area and other areas very similar to it. And I remember it just being a Black problem. It was just kind of like our thing, right? And the way to deal with that was incarceration. People were at their lowest. And now that's not that's still the situation, but it's not solely a Black person's problem or a Black community any longer, right? And my fear is that, I'm speaking to the choir here, but my fear is that folks don't believe it's going to hit home until it hit home. And this is, I want us to say we care about it before it happens in our own communities, because it's happening to our fellow man, our fellow woman, other people that are share the state with us, share the cities with us. And so again, I think majority, and just closing, it's a small percent of individuals who drive this violence, and 99% something want to see the violence end in those communities. They just don't always know what to do about it, which is a feeling I think we can all register with it. So with that, we'll leave it open for questions and answers, and I appreciate you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And we appreciate you, believe me, for coming out from Chicago and the north suburbs to come and talk to us tonight. I'm gonna just let you know, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. You'll have to wait while I trek over to you and give you the microphone so our at-home viewers can hear the question that you want to ask. But just as a general question, Phil had a wonderful editorial in the Daily Herald recently that was read, and you were recommended to be our speaker by Bernie sitting there. And but when you talk about, and I'm sure both of you can talk about it, is the 3 C's. You talk about the fact that one of the ways to prevent violence is compassion, courage, and cooperation. Compassion for those who are suffering, courage to have this, to speak up, and cooperation with our police force so that they have support to know that we welcome their intervention when required. I guess my question is, long prelude, is when do we know when compassion needs to turn into action? So we see a student as a teacher who's suffering, or we see a neighbor who's having problems. We can be compassionate and help them, but when do we know when to stand up and take action? Either one of you.
Yeah, that's a great question around compassion. And, when I think about that word, compassion actually has an active piece to it. That it's one thing to empathize, it's one thing to sympathize, it's one thing to feel sorry and recognize, yeah, that's really terrible. But it's another thing to take action. And that action can be at so many levels. And I think that's where the courage piece comes in, is sometimes it's just engagement. Like, hey, I can tell you're having a hard time. What if we knew that there was a child in our community that was disconnected, that was ideating around violence, and we knew it. And listen, as a security professional, I see this nearly daily, where someone in the community this is exactly happening. Every one of our high schools in the area are dealing with this, and somebody knows much earlier, and they saw it on Instagram. It was communicated in some way, in a way that we can't see, that the police department can't monitor Snapchat. They don't have the legal authority to do it, but we can. And if we have the kind of relationship with those youth or our own children, and they know that they can trust us with a piece of information, or even if they have doubts about it, that we've created ways for them to anonymously say, hey, I'm worried about somebody. I'm not saying they're going to go shoot a school, but I'm worried about somebody. And that information gets followed up on. And that's exactly what Chris is talking about here. He's hearing about shootings, but what if we hear about somebody who's ideating about violence or feeling very disconnected and trending in a way that violence might be the outcome? That's where this compassion, and you need the courage to lean into it. And we need the sort of trust in relationships. If we don't trust our police department that they're going to react in the right way, if we don't trust that there'll be a referral to mental health. But the other piece there is that trust is really forged in relationship. And I think that's this nut that Chris and his team and the work that they're doing in this intervention work that is being funded around the state is recognizing that you don't change lives without first building a relationship that turns into trust and then allows you to introduce new ideas that maybe your life doesn't have to be this way. Maybe there are other options. And I'm saying this as somebody who is the beneficiary of a lot of healthy systems. At 20 years old, I was shot and nearly killed in a school shooting. And I'm standing before you as somebody who had a very interesting career with the FBI and is now in this space. And it's because those systems existed. And if those systems don't exist, we've got to go build them. If there's some disconnect that our police department doesn't know who to refer, we don't have the legal authority here to arrest somebody or take away guns, but we are still concerned about what's going on in this house. Who backfills? Is there a referral to our community mental health network? Do our churches lean in? Is the park district? Is the school? These are all great systems. If they're healthy, they can as they did for me, they can provide amazing opportunities. But there's always still that gap if there isn't a healthy relationship with someone who's going to pull them into those services. That could be a coach, a teacher, a pastor, a friend. And that's why that courage and compassion is so connected.
Yeah, and I just add a piece. I often think about it and talk about it as like a highway system. And if you stay on this highway and continue to speed, then obviously law enforcement will jump in and you'll get your speeding ticket. But if you feel like that's the only life that you're bound to, whatever your circumstance is, to provide an off ramp, to provide an opportunity for someone to get off of this busy highway of life, And what we're seeing on both ends, right? So thinking about like larger shootings that have been diverted, or shootings that happen on a daily day basis, or suicide, or in other ideations, folks are calling out and they're reaching out to someone, right? And so in a lot of cases, many of us have been fortunate to land on someone's lap or shoulder, talk to them, they walk us through it, and we get through that circumstance. In many people's lives, there's no one to turn to, right? And so providing that network that provides compassion, but doesn't take away from our law enforcement partners, right? Law enforcement is a needed instrument in our society. We support it wholeheartedly, but now we have to figure out, okay, well, how else can we give some, part of compassion is giving people options other than, simply incarceration if it's not needed necessarily. So thank you.
Chris, do your programs educate the communities besides, I mean, people in the communities who are interested, like all of us here and online, on signs and symptoms to watch for, what are good intervention techniques, when you're not going to be the Karen in the neighborhood that.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great question. And just for clarification, my office is the state funding agency. So we would provide the opportunity for providers who are already doing this great work. And so since, some people say since the 1940s, street outreach work has existed in places like Chicago. It's just never been to scale, and it's never been invested in by the government. Right. And so over the years, Northwestern University and other partners have done phenomenal research and evaluation around the work and shown where street outreach is coupled with community services, coupled with law enforcement, dramatic decreases in firearm violence are happening. Right. And so, maybe if that kind of pins us and gets to that, that part that you're asking.
But those are the type of programs that you're looking for to establish.
Yeah. And again, it's like not our office saying this is what you should do, but rather supporting those organizations that are already out there.
Thank you for the work that you're doing and for being here tonight, and obviously your history. You just touched on something that I think is so important. I think about this DuPage County community and many people in this room who are volunteers with organizations who have given time. Right now we have 6 townships and 1 county, Will County, who will have a 708 community mental health board levy request referendum for their communities to decide to, again, initiate some very localized resources right in their towns, which is what you're talking about. So we're fortunate that we have a lot of community resource, to your point earlier. I want to clarify a statistic and then ask a question. You talked about 41,000. Give me that number again.
41,000 firearm deaths in America.
Firearm deaths. Okay. So the 2% of the total, is that the number of deaths out of that 41,000?
Yes.
Okay. All
yes,
right.
that are due to mass violence.
Right. And yet, this is rhetorical, it feels like so much more.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what's so daunting, I think. So just 2 quick questions. Does the surge of interventions, does that sustain itself when you do a surge?
It does. So, one of the things, so what we used to do, so I've also worked with an organization called Cure Violence Ceasefire. Love the organization. The way that I learned street outreach was the outreach worker would go into the community, they would establish a relationship with people who are trapped in the cycle of violence, and that outreach worker was everything to the person, everything to the community. It's obviously too much of a burden to put on one individual, and so what we created was the framework that existed with the case management and the victim service. And so what you want to do is, for the sustainability part, is you want to go in, stop the bleeding, right? Almost like as if you're, triaging. And once you stop the bleeding, then the case managers come in to start working on your immediate needs to get you out of that crisis, your family's immediate needs. And then, ultimately what you're doing is if you're doing that for every single household or people who are in crisis, you're actually touching a community, so the sustainability component comes in with the after the services that we we encourage providers to give afterwards and support.
And then just to follow up really quickly, and what you're talking about too is this is long, deep work. It doesn't just happen. Those of us who know social workers who work in the schools know that that relationship to build that trust, it can
Yeah.
take the whole freshman year.
Yeah,
It can take part of their sophomore
Yeah.
year, right? So when we think, well, you have all this money, why can't you just fix it, right?
Yeah.
It's such a long road.
Yeah.
And then lastly, why aren't we hearing more of this kind of work, all the work that's going on? And maybe it's just a 24-hour news cycle, but this kind of information and the commitment by people like yourselves and the day-to-day, I think, is necessary.
Yeah, there's targeted media, right? So it's like one, it's a very new program. We started the office last year. Funding has literally, as you can see, started since December. This is our first summer working with, as an agency, working with the community providers. And so, getting the word out is definitely something we have to get better at, and we're working on. But I can assure you, like those communities in which we're funded in and we're supporting, we've been doing our media tours, our legs with them, and really just working with the providers who are on the ground, making sure that they have the support first. They feel heard and they feel supported the way they're supposed to. So, I think what comes next is us being able to talk about some of the successes that happen because of the programming. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm not a gun advocate. In my city, when the National Rifle Association had their annual meeting, I picketed it, and it was hard to get people to join me. A key issue that I think you neglected, and that is a single parenting. The majority of the kids in the Chicago public schools, single parenting, and they lose interest and drop out and get in trouble. Years ago, the business community put an ad in the Wall Street Journal. Person wanted to reform large Midwestern city in trouble. It was Chicago, and they did a nationwide search. And guess what? They hired me, and we took over the city, and we took over the school system. I appointed all 11 members of the school system. We put the most minorities to work in the summertime in the country. And I could go on, but I'm not your speaker. So I'm going to end there by saying that we have,
You'll be our speaker next month.
we have a leadership crisis. That's the business community isn't doing that anymore. And that's a very serious problem, a leadership crisis. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Comments?
I'll say that it's been a long road, but these solutions have been available and they have been incubated for a long time, but they have not been invested in, as Chris says, at the scale that meets the challenge. But things that start with disconnected youth in an environment that doesn't have opportunity, we don't need one more study to tell us that puts people at risk of gun violence. You can take the same overlay on his map and look at lead poisoning, health outcomes, nutrition, and you will find the same correlation with gun violence. We've studied this enough. Now, having the real courage to invest in the hard work of building relationships, this is hard work. The outreach workers that are at the end of this funding, they need wellness. They need professional human resources. They need a day off. They need to know that they can make a career out of doing this work, and that maybe next year they won't have to find a new job because some foundation gave them 2 years of money and then moved on to another issue. This is the first time that we are making a sustained governmental investment in exactly what you're saying. So that another reason for us, I think, to be hopeful. We are looking at the data, we are following the science, we know what works, and we are investing in the people who are pretty darn good at this work.
Thank you both for speaking and for your presentations. I was just wondering, with this new program for investing all of these funds, and I don't know if you would have the benchmarks or the goal of what success looks like, but I was just wondering, what is the goal down the road, and do you have any benchmarks for success?
I do. Um, at the end of the day, working in violence prevention, I've had a front row seat to quite a bit, and that's a hard space to be looking. And so I want to first say that we have to make sure that fewer mothers are burying their children, right? That's our first stop. When community members feel safe, right, is when we hit the mark. There was a lady in one of the communities I was working with, and that community was experiencing about a 50% reduction in shootings. And the police department were, kind of touting about like all the success. And this lady's who lived there all her life, she said it's never been worse than it is today. And that's with a 50% reduction. So it's the perception. Do people in communities like the ones I showed on the screen, do they feel safe? Again, our moms not bearing their children in that very backwards dynamic. And then we'll start to see, community levels dropping, right? I want to see communities continue to drop down 50%, 70%, right? And then, the saddest part about some of the work that we've been doing, a couple years ago, we were trying to become like New York and Los Angeles, who for the last 10 and 15 years have been under 300 murders. A lot of people don't know that. But man, like our level of success is less than 300 murders, 300 families. And so, for me personally, it's got to be all or nothing. But I think that, once the community members start to feel a little bit safer coming out of their house, allowing their children to play in the parks, right? And that could be a measure of success we can seek.
So this program sounds really wonderful and very hopeful. As you said at the beginning, you're very hopeful. Hopefully we are all very hopeful. It's an Illinois program and we live in Illinois, so we are going to benefit from it. There are 49 other states in the United States that also experience violence, gun violence and other violence. Is there a federal program? Are other states emulating? Did you emulate other programs? It can't be just a state issue. It has to be a national, because it's a national crisis.
Yes, I agree with you. I've been saying that. They're listening. Somebody's listening. I give you an example of how this timeline is looked. So we started, I started doing this work about 12 years ago. And we've always raised private dollars. When we created a consortium of Community Partnering for Peace, a group of community organizations that came together, we lobbied and pulled together private philanthropy. And we raised in like a 6 or 7 year period, close to $190 million to sustain this level of work because the government's different entities, the county, the city, and the state didn't want to touch it. Very risky, right? How are you going to invest in gang members, right? We were mocked sometimes and said, you're going to hug a thug, stuff like that. It's like people didn't understand, just lock them up. That's the strategy. And we stuck to our guns and we made it work. And so now to the point of like leadership standing up, when the governor heard about this strategy, he invested heavily. So people are listening. Now the Biden administration has dedicated 250 million minimum, just to start for what they call the CVI, or the Community Violence Intervention Programming. And so now all the way from the Department of Justice down, street outreach is viable tool used alongside all the other tools to make communities safer. And so yes, nationally we have partners in every single state. We meet about quarterly to discuss some of our work, my peers in other states. There, quite a lot of work is happening all over the country, and we're really excited about the momentum. So it is happening. Thank you for your question.
Well, I think I have a question about the elephant in the room. I mean, we all think that violence is prevented if we take the guns away. You know, in Illinois, I think that we have a special problem because of the surrounding states have varying drug laws. And so we hear about ghost weapons and we hear about weapons registered and being imported. Is there Illinois legislation that can be done to help prevent some of the violence? To keep the guns out of the hands of people who will do harm to themselves?
There are a number of things that we can do to make it hard for gun violence. And local communities are taking action to coordinate with their police departments and their mental health to make sure that disconnected people are getting the right services. And they're also instituting regulations to take advantage of the firearm restraining order. So when they do identify somebody and they're not cooperative, that they still can take guns away until that person can be stabilized. There's also a fight going on right now to reduce or ban high capacity military style assault weapons, which are almost exclusively used and sought to be used by mass shooters and present a unique threat to law enforcement because those guns fire a bullet at a velocity that penetrates protective police vests. We've known this for a while. We haven't had the political will to do it, but I think that this is something to be hopeful about too, that we are turning the corner about this. We are now studying this as a health issue, that the CDC is now allowed to collect data and we are allowed to get greater insights. But across the country, there's been an investment to allow states to expand their firearm restraining orders, to shore up the background checks so that we're not giving guns to people who shouldn't have guns in the first place. So those two tools are going to be very important. And that's a coordination issue. We have to get our police departments so attuned to that this is how you prevent shootings, is that you do proper background checks and you remove guns from dangerous situations. And there's not a community here that doesn't have a domestic violence problem. And a domestic violence where there's a gun is exceedingly more dangerous. And we know this statistically, but we've got to get attuned to it and start using those tools effectively. But we also need a level of community collaboration where we're willing to talk to each other when we see behavior that we think creates risk in our community. And we've got to trust that the people that we give that to are going to respond. And if we don't, we better start building a relationship with them and making sure they get the training and the resources and the collaboration with their mental health elements that we can start intercede. And so we see what's happening in the areas around the 16 areas around the state that are experiencing the most violence. But that doesn't mean that every community can't have their own LAC and start coordinating how they respond to folks that demonstrate need and dangerous behavior.
Chris, do we have any questions online in the chat? Are there any questions? I think we're all just overwhelmed thinking of what we can do.
Well, I'm old enough to have grown up in the 50s when my high school, which had a minority population, and segregation was in play in the 50s, okay? But they were all intact families. Our high school had a rifle club. So kids would roam the hall with their rifles going to the club meeting. We had no violence problems at all. And I grew up with families that went hunting, so there were guns in the house. We didn't have those problems, but we had intact families. Now, what I'm concerned about is we've been told when this Safety Act goes into effect in Illinois, January 1st, we're going to have no cash bail and we're going to have no consequences for bad behavior. So this leads to more violence. What can you speak on this Safety Act that the governor has signed with no cash bail?
Well, look, there are lot of challenges right now with criminal justice reform and law enforcement. But if we look at the data and we follow what we know is working, and we also follow the notion that we're in this together, there are opportunities for intervention long before we reach a point where somebody's turning to violence. And when we look at the mass violence, something like 60% of those folks that commit a mass gun violence attack, like in Highland Park, they've demonstrated very clear signs that we can recognize, that are available to all of us. And we need to share those. People in the community have that information. So when you talk about intact families, how about an intact community that's willing to say, gosh, my neighbor's son is really at risk. And we could guess you could buy another ring, or you can lock a door, or you could buy a gun, or you could let somebody know that could be involved in engaging them. And yes, it's hard work and it might take a while, but we know that it prevents violence. So falling back to these old narratives of, I wish we had better families. You know, I wish my family would get along better at Thanksgiving. But it doesn't stop us from getting together. And it doesn't result in these other things, because we recognize that we belong and have responsibilities to a larger communities. And the gun owners among us do as well. They have a responsibility to our larger community, and that's to keep their guns safe and secure, just like those children did when they walked through the hallway with unloaded guns that I assure you they had no bullets for until they arrived at the range. And that's not just my protocol, that's a military protocol. That's a national shooting sports protocol. That's the National Rifle Association protocol. Why? Because we know it promotes safety.
Chris, any final words for us?
You know, you may have one question in the back.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
And thank you for your service. Your community violence intervention, you mentioned lean into it. My question is how for the community to do that? Is requesting a well-being check, is that an option when you see something and difficulty with child? Is that something that the community can do? Is request a well-being check to initiate and acknowledge that there is problem in the community? And yes, can you check on this child or this family? Is that being viewed as an option for the community to use to help
Yeah.
our community?
Great question. And so the nature of the street outreach professional is someone who is paid, trained, who is driven to watch for those very signs in young people who are in the neighborhoods in which they're working in. Once that happens, the word that we use often is interruption, right? And so when you see that risky behavior, particularly in the day-to-day gun violence that we hear about often, you want to interrupt the cycle of violence. And that's what our paid professionals are out there doing. So yes, they're oftentimes running into that fire or that very risky situation to de-escalate a situation before it turns into a matter for law enforcement. So
I think she's asking,
Yeah,
it's like,
I-
can we call for a well-being check?
that is absolutely the question to ask in your community. That if, yes. And I'm going to say that it depends on the community, and it depends on.
Or that individual and say, can we do a well-being check on this child, this family?
Yes.
Is that an option? And yes, it should be an option. And there should be some training possibly in the police department to attribute, say, hey, we're going to use this vehicle to anonymously
Yes.
contribute for our community, to elder to speak up and say, "Hey, I'm concerned, I saw this, and it's a family member," and
Use the well-being check as a vehicle for anonymous reporting to say, I want to check in on this child or this family. And that there's training for the police to say, hey, it's a well-being check. Let's go check this out. So then from there,
Absolutely, it's an option, but it is not an option in every community because every community hasn't embraced the idea that it's okay to say, hey, I've got a concern. I'm not sure who to call. I've called the police, or I found an anonymous way to report this. Schools are building this out. School districts that are being very thoughtful about violence prevention are recognizing that they need a referral service. They need to be able to hear from parents and students alike, and even faculty. And sometimes they have to have an anonymous way of saying it. And so communities that are really getting this, and the communities that I consult, the first thing I ask is, have you taught the students what they should look for? And have you given them multiple ways of sharing this? And if kids trust adults, they tell them. If kids trust other kids, they tell them. If kids trust their parents, they tell them. And I'll tell you, I've been with many communities where for months, there's pictures have been circulating on Snapchat of somebody demonstrating dangerous behavior with a firearm, and it was not reported. So we have to go back and reinforce those ideas, or maybe there's something wrong with our systems. Maybe they don't trust us. And if they don't, we better find out why. But I've also seen communities where parents have called the school district and said, I found guns under my child's bed. I'm frightened. And it got the proper response. You didn't even hear about it. Resources surged in, violence was prevented, a child got their well-being check and the right resources. So we don't have much opportunity to celebrate those kind of successes, but the communities that are being very deliberate about creating those channels are seeing a lot of success in violence prevention.
I think a perfect example is one of our local high schools. A student brought a gun to school, but luckily the other students trusted the school professionals and reported it. And crisis was averted, but it was due to that trust that had been established that you spoke of earlier. So, Chris, any programs that are working specifically on that you know of in the state?
I think to Phil's point, in each one of the communities, there's going to be, those singular nuances that, communities are embracing or not. The work that we're doing today is just talking about educating our folks to say what is possible. So Reimagine Public Safety Illinois means just that. Can we rethink about the way that we approach firearm violence? Can we rethink about the way that we approach those who are in disadvantaged situations or not feeling well mentally? 10 years ago, and I'll close with this, 10 years ago, we used to think about violence prevention in the form of getting them a job, right? If I can just get this person a job, put them to work, it's all going to be better for the community. And then we realized with untreated trauma that none of that matters, right? We have to start caring for individuals before they pick the guns up. And we can often see those indicators in our communities. We can often see the indicators in my neighbor, in my own children, in myself, right? And so really paying attention to people's mental health and welfare is really the foundation of the work that we're doing. And all the other dollars just go on top of that to support that initial work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here. Thank you for what you're going to go out and do in your communities.
That's right.
all these,
I'll be in stereo beyond belief. So, wow.
oh, wow, thank you so much, Phil, Andrew.
Chris Patterson, for making us smarter about violence. We're grateful that you shared your evening with us. And thank you to our audience here and online for sharing your evening with us as well. And a big thank you to our partners at Cantigny, Will, Andrew, and Chris. And also a thank you to our sister leagues, Glen Ellyn, Roselle, Bloomingdale, Naperville. I know I'm missing Central Kane County. So the League of Women Voters mission is to defend democracy and empower voters by registering and educating voters. The League is a strictly nonpartisan political organization that never supports or opposes any candidate or political party. We're committed to providing fact-based information and open discussion forums to help voters make their own decisions. Save the date, October 23rd, from 11:30 to 5 p.m. Get to know your candidates with a meet and greet and several candidate forums actually right here at Cantigny. So be sure to save that date. It's a Sunday. And even if you're a football fan, come here. So also please join us next month, October 13th at 7 p.m. for our Civic Awareness program. Dr. Terry Wu, we actually, those of you who were at the convention or virtually or in person, saw him, and he'll talk about why we get angry when we talk about politics. And he is very insightful. So I really encourage you to attend as well. We're looking forward to seeing you again next month, and please drive safely for those of you who are here, and good night. Thanks so much.